Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Jeffrey Saks of Atid and Web Yeshiva, coming to you live from Beit Agnon in Yerushalayim in front of a live studio audience. Applaud so they can hear you at home. And we are continuing our study of the connection between Agnon and Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Last week we had a kind of introduction to the topic. I would say now that we're going to actually look into a story, we kind of got rushed for time at the end, and there were things that I didn't get to last week, which I'm not going to now go into now because that would come, at the expense of the story we're wanting to look at. So just understand that more than is said here is meant here, and we could meet on other occasions in the future to finish out all the stuff that we didn't get to. But I'll remind you of what Rabbi Nachman himself said about storytelling. Rabbi Nachman turns to storytelling late in his career. His career was short. You understand, the tuberculosis got him at a young age. But he turns to storytelling as a mode of teaching rather late in his career. And he says, Ha'olam omrim shesipurei ma'asiyot misugal l'shena. There are those out there in the Welt, in the world, who say that storytelling is a recipe for sleep. You know, like when you were small and your mommy used to tell you a story before you went to sleep at night. You know, my kids, I can't tell you how many hours I've spent reading to children. You know, thank God we have 4 children, but they're all widely spaced out. Our eldest, thank God, finished the Army last week, and our youngest is finishing 2nd grade this week. So it's a lot of story time. It's a lot of reading. It's a lot of, going from Dr. Seuss to works of more significant impact and hours. But you do that thing where you're reading to your kids at night, and you try to read in a very soft voice, and you read slowly, and their eyes begin to close, and then you whisper it off, and you try to get out of the bed and tiptoe out, and as you're halfway out the door, she says, more. But that idea of like reading yourself to sleep, that line that we saw last week from that book by Kamenetz about how books are so central, certainly in our world. Certainly, and I'm not chauvinistic enough to think that Jews are the only one that have this special relationship to books, but a little bit. And that line from Kamenetz about how the books we read become part of us. They shape us. They form us. They form our identity. They form our outlook. And I can't tell you that from a young age, I was accustomed to this idea of reading before. I don't think I'd be able to fall asleep if I wasn't reading. And the next morning I find the book on the floor sometimes, and I have to figure out what page was I up to. And so the idea that reading is a kind of antidote to amnesia, not amnesia. Insomnia. Ha'olam omrim shesipuray ma'asiyot misugal l'shena. Va'ani, says Rabbi Nachman, va'ani amarti shesipuray ma'asiyot misugalim le'orer mehashena. Au contraire, stories are the things that can wake you from your slumber, not your physical slumber, your spiritual slumber, your mental slumber. In the Sipurei Ma'asiyot, I'm sorry that I neglected to bring it, although I guess I could have brought Agnon's copy from upstairs. In the Sipurei Ma'asiyot, there are various collections of Rabbi Nachman's stories, but the kind of classic canon is these 13 stories that were first published in 1815 in a Hebrew Yiddish edition. Because remember, these were oral teachings. Rabbi Nachman would say over the story, and the recitation of the story was something kind of akin to, well, it was, like now they have this thing, this performance art, like where storytelling as performance art, you can go to pubs or clubs or wherever, and they have these things. So that's not what Rabbi Nachman was doing. It wasn't like a stand-up act, lahavdil. It was storytelling as a kind of, I always imagine it, and there are descriptions of the Hasidim that were there, but I always imagine it being something between a shi'ur a Torah class, and prayer. And in the Sipurei Ma'asiyot, the collection of the 13 canonical stories, one of which we'll look at tonight, there's an introduction, a hakdama, which is a tefillah. A tefillah, a prayer that should be recited before or after the study of the stories. The same way, like if you have a tilim, there are these people that are tilim zogers, right? They recite, you can go on to any bus to Yerushalayim any day of the week, and you can and you can see Mrs. Carson, right? Usually I always think of her as a kind of little shriveled Sephardi lady, but you can find a rather elegant Ashkenazia as well, sitting on the bus, zogin tilim. If those of you that have studied Agnon's or read Agnon's Tehillah with me, which is a story that I've taught many times, Tehillah is one of these. She measures out her days with the recitation of Tehillim. The 150 chapters of Tehillim are divided up. There are two different cycles. There's one cycle that divides it into 7 sections, so you finish all of Sefer Tehillim once a week. And there's another one, perhaps more popular, where it's divided into 30 over the month, and every day has its portion of Tehillim to be recited. And the people, often women, but not only, who say the Tehillim, do you say the Tefillah al Amirata too? Right? So you do the weekly cycle, right? So, but there's a prayer to be recited upon reciting the Tehillim. So Rabbi Nachman has a prayer to be recited on the recitation of the story, the study of the story, the engagement with the story. And it begins, have mercy upon us with your great kindness, your great, mighty, profound kindness upon us. And awaken us from our slumber, because in our profound, great sins, our multiple sins, we have succumbed, we've been overcome by sleep. Right? Slumber is the symptom of sin, but not slumber. This is not Rip Van Winkle. Right? This is the spiritual slumber that he thought these stories that he turns to late in life are the antidotes to. Agnon's approach to storytelling, of course, was different. I mentioned last week a whole variety of differences between Agnon and Rabbi Nachman. We shouldn't let surface similarities confuse us, although I also made a point of saying there's some very profound connections between the two. Beyond the influence, the aesthetic influence, the artistic influence, the form of the stories that influenced Agnon. But Agnon's significance as a storyteller, his innovation as a Hebrew storyteller, comes from this kind of trying to get at the global scope of the Jewish experience, trying to tell the tale of the Jewish people on a broad canvas, even though that broad canvas, of course, in many ways is quite narrow. Right? It focuses on a particular region of Ashkenazi Jewry in a particular time. But that can serve as a synecdoche. You know that fancy word? Right? A synecdoche is a fancy word. It means a prat that represents the klal, a specific item which stands in for the whole. We do this all the time in common everyday speech. We do this all the time. If I say everything's those Wall Street is ruining everything, I don't actually mean that rather small narrow lane in Lower Manhattan. I'm using Wall Street as a synecdoche for the financial industry, the same way that we talk about Hollywood, even though a lot of our movies are made in China, right? That or the Knesset, right? I don't mean that particular building in Givat Ram. I mean the mechanisms of power by which our country is governed. So Agnon looks at Buchach, his hometown, his little town in what today is Western Ukraine, but then was the eastern reaches of Galicia, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire when he lived there, as a kind of prism through which to understand something about the Jewish people. Right? Maybe not all the Jewish people all at the same time, because after all, our Sephardi brethren were undergoing different experiences, and the transition into modernity that Agnon was describing came to other parts of the Jewish world a little earlier or a little later, but it's a universal experience, even though each community might experience it differently. Agnon distracts the reader by looking backward. How does he look backward? He tells a story. The story that we're going to look at tonight is written in 1919. Is first published in 1919. But it's set 100 years earlier. So it's distracting. The reader thinks this is a kind of historical fiction. He's telling you something about the beginning of the 19th century, when in fact, he's really saying something about our own time. Right? It's often that way with literature. It's often that way with fiction. It's less important when the story is said. It's more important to know when the story is written. Because when it's written, it tells you some of the concerns the author had. This is not true for everyone, but for Agnon, it's prepared to say it's always true, but never believe anyone who tells you always. It's almost always true. And he also distracts the reader by kind of adopting these old genres. You read a story, it looks like a kind of retelling of a Hasidic tale or an old pietistic fable, and you are distracted from precisely how modern it is. In some ways, it's a mirror image to Rabbi Nachman's stories, although the story we're going to look at tonight might be an exception to the rule. It's a mirror image to Rabbi Nachman's stories because when Rabbi Nachman told the stories, and when the stories are written up by Rabbi Nosson, right, they were probably shocking for how modern they appeared. Right? As I mentioned last week, Rabbi Nachman's Hasidic tales are not Hasidic tales. They're not what we normally think of as a Hasidic tale, the little boy with the flute or the wonder tale of the Rebbe or the Baal Shem Tov, etc. They're stories that in many ways take place outside the realm of the Jewish world. They exist in the fantasy world. The two stories that we're looking at tonight, Rabbi Nachman's Maaseh B'Ben Harav, translated in different ways as the tale of the rabbi and his only son, or tale of the rabbi's son, and Agnon's HaNidach, which everyone agrees is among Agnon's most significant, most important works. The subject of ongoing fascination in the 100 years since it was first published, ongoing fascination on the part of literary critics and commentaries on Agnon, but was only translated last year. Why one story gets translated and another doesn't is a topic for a different conversation. When we had, maybe some of you were there, when we had a little celebration for the conclusion of the Agnon series, we talked about that very specific topic, but this story, HaNidach, is the title story of the final volume in the New English series, which was edited by me, called The Outcast and other stories, and that's the story we'll be looking at tonight. And others before me have already identified connections between these two stories. I believe the first to do that was unfortunately overlooked but significant thinker and writer on Agnon is Rabbi Aryeh Weinman. He was a rabbi in upstate New York who wrote and researched on Agnon and published quite a bit and did some very interesting things, although he was not his work was not as well known as it should be. And there were others who also identified other Hasidic sources in the Agnon story we're looking at tonight, specifically sources in Chabad, less in Breslov. The connection of our story to Breslov has to do with the thematic connection But in terms of the source work, the sources on which Agnon is drawing, there's probably a little more from Chabad. And if in the future we have a series on Agnon and Chabad, we can revisit the story from that perspective. Both stories are occupied with this question of fathers and sons and the difficult relationship between the two. These are Agnon's grandparents, his maternal grandparents. Agnon was the product of a mixed marriage. His father was a chassid, a Chortkov chassid, and his mother was the descendant of Misnagdim, arch Misnagdim. This is his maternal grandfather, Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen Farb. Now, in those days, you may have pictures of your own grandparents or great-grandparents. Everybody always looked so stern, because in order for the image to be burned onto the photosensitive plate, you had to sit very still for a long time. Right? Think of those pictures of Lincoln. These photographs were probably taken around, 1880, 1890, not too long after Lincoln. Right? You know those pictures of Lincoln? He always looked so stiff, because you had to sit there like perfectly still for like 60 seconds. Right? So that's why no one smiles in those old pictures, because it's hard to hold that smile for 60 seconds. Everybody kind of looks very serious. But in fact, probably that's the way he really looked. Agnon describes him. He was a parnas. He was an important communal figure in town in Buchach. Agnon's mother's family was from Buchach. Agnon's father moves to Buchach when he marries Agnon's mother sometime in the 1880s. And Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen Farb was an important communal leader. He was a stable balabos. I wouldn't say that he was wealthy, but they lived in comfort. And he was an arch misnagid, even though his daughter married a chassid. Because by the time that Agnon's parents got married in the 1880s, which is more than 100 years after the Baal Shem Tov died, it was already possible to imagine a mixed marriage of this sort. But Rabbi Yehuda HaKohen Farb, he was a misnagid, even though apparently there was a good relationship between father-in-law and son-in-law. He brought his son-in-law into the family business, and they both of them aspired to have their young son and grandson Shmuel Yosef Chachkis become a rabbi. That was the aspiration for the young man, who had kind of artistic interests of his own and who goes off on Aliyah at the age of 20. That said, young Shmuel Yosef was, he was the sun and the moon and the stars in between all orbited him. He was the darling firstborn on both sides. I happen to also be the firstborn on both sides. I'm the oldest grandchild on both sides. I'm the oldest cousin on all sides. It gives you a full sense of being particularly special. My wife tells me that. My wife is the youngest of all of her siblings. I always say you can understand everything about the difference between my wife and I, that I'm the oldest in the family and she's the youngest in her family. It explains a lot. You don't need to be Freud to figure out some of these things. So Agnon has actually a very positive relationship with his father. I mentioned this last week by way of comparison to Lahavdil, Philip Roth. But nevertheless, he writes these stories of generational conflict. So if he's writing stories of generational conflict, if he's writing stories of the kind of need to search out the father figure, which Rabbi Nachman also writes about, which Kafka also writes about, which in a different genre Freud writes about, and all of these things are going into the suit and influencing one another, influencing those that come after. And it has a lot to do with these transitions. It's not autobiographical in the sense that when Agnon writes about generation gap, he's talking about some tension with his own father, with whom he had a very, very loving relationship. But it has something to do with a sense of what happens in the transition of the generations on a larger historical scale. when the Jewish people go through these types of transitions. Rabbi Nachman's story here. We'll start with it here. The tale of the rabbi and his only son. Did anyone read it in Yiddish? I sent it out in 3 languages: the original Hebrew, the original Yiddish, and one of the many English translations. So again, I just remind you, when Rabbi Nachman would have recited the tale in front of the Hasidim, he would have recited in Yiddish. And then Rabbi Nosson, his devoted disciple, immediately after Shabbat would write it up, would prepare a transcript from memory. And then he and Rabbi Nachman would sit together and edit the story, and then translate it into Hebrew. So it was always published. It was, in other words, both the Yiddish and the Hebrew can be considered the product of Rabbi Nachman, even though there are some interesting differences sometimes between the version in Yiddish and the version in Hebrew, right? Which makes one wonder why that would be, since they were published and prepared at the same time. So this particular story. This story is an exception, because this story of all of the Sipurei Ma'asiyot, the 13 tales, and I'm not sure if I elided this fact last week. Remember, Rabbi Nachman's collection of tales are called the Sipurei Ma'asiyot, and Agnon's collection of surrealistic, fabulistic, fantastical tales is called the Sefer HaMa'asim. And I don't think that we should think that that's just a coincidence. Agnon is drawing our attention between the two, which again emphasizes this idea that the influence here is not Kafka, but Rabbi Nachman. This story is exceptional in the fact that it is set within a very distinctly Jewish framework, where the other stories are princesses and magical beasts and who knows what. This is an exception to the rule, and therefore I'm a little sheepish about bringing it, because it's a counterexample before I've given you a very good example of what the Sipurei Ma'asiyot generally look like. It's a story that has surrealism in it. Surrealism means beyond the real, right? We'll talk more about it next week, right? But the surrealism is a genre of fiction, of art, of music, of everything, which is it seems bizarre. Last week I mentioned the famous paintings, the melting, with Dali's, with the melting. Did I mention this last week? Yeah, Dali's famous melting clocks and Miro and these other famous surrealistic paintings. You look at it, you recognize you recognize that that's a clock, but in the reality that we live in, clocks don't behave that way. They don't melt like Camembert cheese, which is what Dali claimed they were meant to represent. Someone asked him if he was trying to say something about Einstein and the relativity of time, and he said no. It's, relativity, if you have a clock that's melting, it doesn't keep time very well, so time is relative. He says, no, it's about Camembert cheese melting. So, and if you ever seen pictures of Dali, with that mustache, he himself was somewhat surrealistic. But when we saw last week the story of the dreams that Rabbi Nachman describes, where he meets the dead guy, and the dead guy comes to him, and Rabbi Nachman says, how come you didn't stay for Rosh Hashanah? And the guy says, well, I'm dead. And he says, so you're dead. Why should I suffer? Right? Why should I be without a chassid on Rosh Hashanah? Right? That's surreal. And it's surreal to depict the dead walking amongst us, not as ghosts. Right? A ghost story is not surreal. Right? Because if you believe in ghosts, right? Or if you don't have to believe in ghosts to read a ghost story. You can suspend your imagination and say, in the world in which the story is set, there's such a thing as ghosts, and their spirits come back. You can imagine them with a white sheet over them, or however you want, right? That's just a ghost story. We introduce, like science fiction is also not surreal, because in science fiction, you accept the idea that space travel faster than the speed of light is possible. Because without that, you can't tell a story of science fiction in space, because you're never going to, how long it takes to get anywhere in space? That's a lot. You'd be watching a lot of seasons of TV before they even get to Mars, right? So you have to have it's a storytelling device. The Starship Enterprise can go at warp factor 10 and can get to different galaxies, within fractions of one episode. So that you can have an interesting stories. You can meet aliens. You can seek out new life and explore new civilizations and boldly go where no man has gone before. But without faster than light travel, you can't go boldly where no man has gone before because it just takes too long. That's not surreal. That's science fiction. Surrealism is our world where we introduce elements that are not real, like the presence of the dead, like the idea that the world, the physical world as we know it, connects in ways that we don't recognize. You wake up in your bed in Yerushalayim, you walk out the front door, and you're in your hometown in Eastern Europe. And it's not like when Dorothy walks out of her house in Kansas and suddenly she's in Oz, because she's been transported there by some magical realism, right? It's because within this surreal world, Yerushalayim and Buchach connect in some surrealistic way. So this story is exceptional in that, although we'll see there's like one particular element, it's a particularly natural story. It's not in a kind of mythic plane. It also has, at least according to the simple, who read the story? Who read? So a happy ending or sad ending? New folks online, would you say it's a happy story or a sad story? So sad. Why is it a sad story? Not just that, because we'll see in a second, because he dies. Usually, when the hero of the story dies at the end, that's a sad story. There are other ways, of course, to understand it. There's also a kind of biographical component here, because Rabbi Nachman, right? And Rabbi Nachman had a chassid. His name was Rav Nosson Sternhertz, or Rabbi Natan. I mean, nobody calls him Natan. He's called Nosson. He was the son of a wealthy misnagid. He was the son-in-law of a wealthy misnagid. But around 1802, he begins to feel that his spiritual life is a bit dry. He lives in the city of Nemirov. I mentioned that last week. It's where we just came up on Kaf Sivan the other day, which is the anniversary in 1648. In 1648, on Kaf Sivan, the 20th of Sivan, was the worst pogrom in the history of the Jewish people up until the Holocaust. Right? Chmelnytsky, 1648. And the Gzerot Tach V'Tat, these pogroms that sweep Eastern Europe in 1648, 1649. So in Kaf Sivan, in and around the city of Nemirov, which is today in central Ukraine, it's where the center of the Ukrainian vodka industry is located. I mentioned this story last week that we stopped last year to buy vodka. It's very close to Breslov. It's very close to Uman. In 1802, Rabbi Nachman has to relocate to Breslov. It's called Nachman. The Chassidut is called Breslov on that, but he gets to Breslov very late in life. He's born and raised in Medzibush, which was the Baal Shem Tov's town. 1802, he arrives in Breslov. And not far away, a couple hours on horseback, in Nemirov is this Rabbi Nosson, son and son-in-law of Arch Misnagdim, who's feeling a little dry, a little spiritually empty. And he goes off. It's been known to happen. People find, even as adults, they find a Rebbe, and they become Chassidim, even if they didn't grow up that way. And he becomes the devoted disciple of Rabbi Nachman. Last week I called him his Boswell. That Nosson was Boswell to Rabbi Nachman's Johnson. Someone afterwards said to me, "Are you sure they all knew what you were talking about?" But we live in a world where we all carry around the collected wisdom of civilization in our pockets. So if you don't know who Boswell and Johnson are, it's not too late to find out. So Rabbi Nosson is responsible for writing up the Torahs of Rabbi Nachman Rabbi Nachman wrote very little of his own teachings. It was all Rabbi Nosson who writes it up and then publishes it in Rabbi Nachman's lifetime, and then for many years after Rabbi Nachman meets his unfortunate early tragic end. This is true for a lot. It's true. It's another coincidence. It's true for Agnon. Agnon published 9 books in his lifetime, and he, thank God, he had a very long life, long and productive and active life. But after he died, he tasked his daughter, Emuna Yaron, who just passed away a couple of years ago, to put out all of his unpublished writings and to collect his stories that had appeared only in newspapers and hadn't been put in book form. And she put out 14 volumes after he died. And it's certainly true, of course, for Kafka as well, who said to his Boswell, Max Brod, burn it all. And Max went off, of course, and speedily printed it instead, or hid it in suitcases in a Tel Aviv apartment waiting for a lawsuit. This story about the rabbi and his son reflects something of the biography of Rabbi Nosson, the son of a well-to-do misnagid who's looking for something, right? The person who has a rav but doesn't have a Rebbe. You know what the difference between a rav and a Rebbe is? The difference between a rav and a Rebbe is the difference between cold cholent and hot cholent. All the same ingredients, but a completely different experience. Rabbi Nachman's own father, Rabbi Simcha, was the son of an important chassid of the Baal Shem Tov. And on his mother's side, Rabbi Nachman is a descendant of the Baal Shem Tov. And on his father's side, he's a descendant of Rabbi Nachman. He's called after his paternal grandfather, Rabbi Nachman Horodenka, who was one of the main disciples, main chassidim of the Baal Shem Tov. But he has a kind of complicated relationship, Rabbi Nachman, with his own father, and then with father figures later in life. I mentioned last week his struggle with Rabbi Leib Shpola, the Shpola Zaydi, who was a kind of leading chassid in the area, with whom he struggled. Had this kind of conflict with authority, conflict with father figures, is something that appears in all of these things. There's another element here that we should keep in mind before we get into the story itself, and that's Rabbi Nachman's own son, Rabbi Shlomo Ephraim, died at a young age in 1806, right at the time that Rabbi Nachman makes the turn to storytelling as his main mode of teaching. Rabbi Nachman felt some guilt over this, so a story that features the death of a son should bear that particular autobiographical element in mind. So here's the story. You can see it up here on the screen. A tale, ma'aseh, or in Yiddish, a maaseh. Who can read it in Yiddish? Nobody? Look, my mother always told me it's not polite to discuss a woman's age. But it could be that there are some people here who it's shaykh to think you might still be able to read Yiddish. But if you can't, then it's Gonish Helsen. Nobody else will be able to. Maisa. There once was a rabbi who had no children. Later he had an only son, and he raised him and made him a wedding. The son would sit in an attic, but the fact that he's already married does not mean he's an adult. Right? The custom was to marry you off shortly after your bar mitzvah. So the boy, there's no indicator in the story one way or the other. But when I read the story, I imagine a young teenager, 13, 14, 15. He would sit and learn, as was the way of the wealthy. It's only the wealthy could afford to not have to apprentice the son to the shoemaker. So he was able to sit and learn. He would study and pray constantly, except that he felt in himself a lacking due to some deficiency, but he didn't know what, and he had no taste, no satisfaction, no batampt in his learning and praying. He told this to 2 young people, and they advised him he should travel to a certain tzaddik. Now, in this story and in Agnon's story, tzaddik means a Rebbe, Chassidish Rebbe, Chassidic master. Now, this son had done a certain mitzvah through which he had reached the aspect of Me'or HaKatan, the smaller luminary. This is a Kabbalistic idea. It reminds us, of course, of what the Gemara says about the relationship between Moshe and Yehoshua. Moshe is the great luminary, the Me'or HaGadol, the sun. Joshua is the Me'or HaKatan, the lesser, the moon. But the moon has no light of its own. It's a reflection of the master of the sun. But the sun had done a certain mitzvah. It doesn't specify what. In the Kabbalistic schema, it's a minor aspect of Malchut. But that's unimportant for understanding the story. But he's achieved some spiritual rung. The only son went and told his father, inasmuch as he feels no taste in his service, meaning he's got no batamt in his mitzvot, something's missing and he doesn't know what. Therefore, he wants to travel to this tzaddik about whom they told him as above. Well, this is like crazy. Like, imagine going to, it'd be like, I don't know. I can only imagine. I mean, if my kid were to come to me and say, today everything's good. My kid would come to me and say, I'd like to go find a Rebbe, become a chassid. So, of all of the possible things that might happen to a kid today, halavai, dayenu, that should be the worst thing that ever happens to us. Your kid wants to daven with a little hislavus and put on a gartel, and we have such a family in Efrat. Kids went Hasidic. The gartel, the payas, the whole thing. The parents are delighted, right? Because you look at Rahmanis, you look at some other families. I don't know why those should be our only two choices, but if we live in a binary world. His father answered him, how do you come to decide he's worthy for you to travel to him? You are, after all, more scholarly, more pedigreed than him. It doesn't suit you to travel to him. Desist from this way. It's a mishigas, right? I mean, it would be like your kid today. It would be like in the world in which the story is set. It'd be like your kid. Your kid comes home from yeshiva and says, "I want to go off to an ashram," right? I mean, so the father dissuades him. The son returns to his learning, but again, it's dry. There's nothing there, so he goes back. And this happens several times that he's trying to get the father to agree. He's begging him to allow him to go to the chassid. So the father says to him, "Look, I'll go with you. I'll show you this tzaddik is nothing at all." Meaning he agrees to travel with him to the tzaddik to show him that it's all a fake array. With this, I'll make a test. If everything goes orderly, if on our journey everything is smooth, min hashamayim, it's from heaven. And if not, it's a sign that it's not min hashamayim, that we should go see this fake array Rebbe. They set out, they reach a small bridge, the horse fell, the carriage turns over, they nearly drown. So that's a pretty good sign, right? The father said to him, "You see, it's not going so smooth, this journey of ours." So they go home. But the son still has this desire. So they set out again. He makes the same condition. If it all goes smoothly, it's a good sign. And what happens? Both axles of the carriage break. The father said, "See, events are not indicating we should travel." Again, they return. The son. So this is the rule of three. In storytelling, there's this idea of the rule of three. How many little pigs were there? Right? How many bears were there? Rabbi Nachman adopts these almost universal storytelling. You see that there's artistry to it, right? In other words, you go once, twice, three times. Then the rule of three. In humor, the rule of three is also always the case, right? In other words, something happens. In the setup to the joke, right? A priest, an imam, and a rabbi walk into a bar, right? So the priest, this joke. Let's tell the joke like this. It's a good demonstration. A priest, an imam, and a rabbi walk into the bar. And it doesn't have to be a bar. It could be like a theological conference. But it's funnier if you say it's a bar. And they say to him, "Oh, here are three holy men. Tell us, when you leave this world, when you shuffle off the mortal coil, and your body is laid out what do you hope that the people around you will be saying? So the priest says, I hope that my flock will say he was a devoted disciple of Jesus and he tried to do charity in this world. And the imam says, I hope they'll say he was a righteous servant of Allah and we know he's gone off to his reward with the 70, whoever he hangs out with. And the rabbi says, I hope they'll stand around and say, wait, he's still breathing. That's a very profound statement about the Jewish view. If you understand anything at all about what Rabbi Soloveitchik has to say about halachic man, all of halachic man can be understood through this joke. But it would take a little while to explain how the joke explains what Rabbi Soloveitchik says about halachic man, who is this worldly focused. Right? We shouldn't be so concerned about the next world. Focus on this world and everything else will work out. It's a very profound Jewish joke, but the humor comes because the rule of three. The priest says what you expect him to say. The imam says what you expect, and the rabbi is the yotzei dof. Right? House of straw, house of sticks, house of bricks doesn't fall down. Right? It's a storytelling trope which Rabbi Nachman adopts here, and the stories can be examined not just for their religious, spiritual component, but as works of literature. So you go the third time they go forth, and again he still feels this deficiency. Again, the only son went to his father and pressed him. The son said to his father, "We should no longer set up this whole idea you have that if something goes wrong on the trip, that's a sign that we shouldn't go to the Rebbe." Who said? Sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes you get a flat tire. Sometimes there's a puncture. That doesn't mean that you're not supposed to, right? I mean, if you had a flat tire on your way to your wedding, would you say, that's a sign I shouldn't marry this girl? No. They travel, they come to an inn to spend the night. Another element in a lot of these types of stories. Along the way, you stop at an inn. In an inn, you're liable to encounter all types of people. They met a merchant there. And they began talking with him as merchants are wont. I remind you, Rabbi Nosson was the son of a merchant. They were speaking about worldly matters until the conversation came around to the subject of tzaddikim, where tzaddikim are found. The merchant told them, there's a tzaddik here and there's a tzaddik there. They began speaking about the tzaddik to whom they're traveling. The merchant answered him, that person? He's plainly a kal. Now, in Hebrew, kal, the translator here just writes kal. Kal literally means a light one, meaning a lightweight, right? Meaning a spiritual lightweight, or even worse than that, someone who is of unrefined character. This will come back. Agnon will use the word in a moment. That's why it's relevant to know what the original is. In other words, he's not a serious Jew. Just now, says the merchant, just now I was there and I saw him commit a certain transgression. Remember, the boy did a certain mitzvah, and with that mitzvah he was zocher to be the smaller light. But this Rebbe, he did a certain aveira, he did a certain sin. The father replied to his son, you see? What this merchant is telling us innocently, meaning he's speaking, he doesn't know that like we're doing this test, right? Mesiach lafi tumo, right? Speaking innocently, he reports to us, not knowing that we've got any investment in this matter, right? He tells us that this Rebbe is not really a holy man, right? They returned home, right? They set out once the horses, second time the axle, they set out the third time, and they find out the Rebbe is a fake. Right? He's a charlatan. So they go back home, but what happens? And the son died. Oh, what a stark turn of the tone of the story. And the son died. He appeared in a dream to his father. Now here he appears in a dream. This is not surrealism, because the dead do appear to us in dreams. That's very real. We've all experienced that. He appeared to him in a dream of his father. His father saw him standing in great anger. His father asked him, why are you so angry? The son answered that he should travel to that tzaddik to whom they had wanted to travel. And he'll tell you why I'm angry. As the father woke up, he said to himself, it's a coincidence because, people dream, dreams. It's a meaningless dream. But then when he dreams it a third time, he understood that it's no empty thing, and he traveled to that tzaddik. On the way, who does he bump into? That very same merchant. The rabbi recognized him and said, "Aren't you the one I saw at the inn?" "Certainly you saw me." The merchant then opens up his mouth supernaturally wide and says to him, "If you want, I'll swallow you up." There's a scene in an Agnon story called HaMashal v'HaNimshal, which is translated in A City in Its Fullness as it's a separate volume called A Parable and Its Lesson, in which a rabbi and his chassid have to go to Gehenna in order to find someone so that they can release this dead man's aguna who's left on earth. That's a kind of, it's kind of borrowing actually from Dante, the descent into hell. And the description of what hell is like and what the shadim are like and what the devil is like is exactly this idea that he can open his mouth so wide. Like this, if you were to picture this, if you were to paint it, it would be surreal. That you can open your mouth so wide that your kind of mouth goes all the way back, right? So that you're all mouth, you're this all-consuming jaws. So the merchant opens his mouth and says, "I can consume you. I'll swallow you up." The rabbi says, "What do you say? What are you talking about?" He answered him, "Do you remember when you journeyed with your son the first time? A horse fell on the bridge, and the axles broke, and then you met me, and I told you that the tzaddik is a kal? Now that I've exterminated your son, now you're welcome to go and see the Rebbe. Now that I've exterminated your son, for your son was Me'or HaKatan. He had achieved, he was on the way. He had reached the spiritual rung. And that Rebbe, far from being a kal, a frivolous Jew, he's the Me'or HaGadol. And you know what would have happened if the two of them got together? Mashiach would have come. So my job, says the merchant. Who is this merchant? He's Satan. He's the Yetzer Hara. Right. My job is to keep the two of them apart. So I tried to stop you. I pushed the horses into the river. I tried to stop you. I broke the axles. But when I saw you were persistent, I had to kill your son, because there was no way I was going to let these two get together. Because if they did, the combination would have brought Mashiach, and we can't let that happen. Now that I've exterminated him, if you want to go to the Rebbe, b'vakasha. And as he was speaking, the merchant suddenly vanished. This is surrealism. The rabbi didn't have with whom to talk, so he traveled to the tzaddik and cried out, "Oy vey, woe, what was me? Such a pity for that which is lost and unfindable." And then the story ends, Hashem Yitbarach Yashiv Nidachenu Bikarov Amen. May the Lord return our Nidachim, our banished ones, our exiled ones, our outcasts. The story in Hebrew is called HaNidach, speedily in our days. In other words, the son in the story is a Nidach. He's been cast out of this world to prevent him from uniting with the Rebbe. And then there's a PS, a kind of like interpretive unpacking of the story, in the way that Aesop's fables, Lahavdil, often have. They unpack the story for you. The notes following the story. It tells you the merchant was the Samech Mem himself. Samech Mem is a euphemism for the Sitra Achra, for Satan, who disguised himself as a merchant and deceived them. Then, when he met the rabbi, the second time, he himself taunted the rabbi for having followed his advice. That's the way it is with the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. First, he incites a person, and when the person follows him, heaven forbid, he himself taunts the person afterwards and takes vengeance on him for having listened. May God save us from him, from the Yetzer Hara, and bring us back to the proper truth. That's the Rabbi Nachman story. Rabbi Nachman is drawing on a whole variety of ideas which get embedded in the Outcast. Now let's look at the Outcast. HaNidach again. HaNidach was written. There was a very short version of it. Agnon often did this. He'd write a story that's really just. In 1909, he published a very short, earliest version of the story under the title Aliyat Neshama, the Ascent of the Soul. And then he worked on it and published it in its longer form. The long form now is in English, it's about 50 pages. We're only going to look at some short sections of it. Is it too cold in here? So somebody can go tell the woman at the desk to turn down the air conditioning. I think people are passing out from the cold. 1919, he publishes the story more or less in the form that we have it today. And he actually had thought of expanding it into a novel. He thought this would be like the first garin, the first seed of something he could expand to a novel, and he struggled with it. It took him a long time. Authors usually start as short story writers, and then they write novella. They try to work up to. You don't usually start off as a novelist. Agnon had a lot of trouble with the novel. It took him a long time from the time he started writing until the time he publishes his first novel. And that's a topic of a different conversation, Agnon's relationship with the novel as an artistic form. But he recognized in the story as being something of significance. The story is written in 1919 when he's in Germany, in the period when he's in Germany, the period when he was not traditionally observant. He had grown up, of course, in a completely traditional environment. He studied in Cheder. His home, we would today recognize his home as Haredi. But at the age of 20, when he arrives in Eretz Yisrael, like almost every other young man of the second Aliyah, he abandons traditional observance. And then he returns to it when he returns to Eretz Yisrael in 1924, after his home burns down in Germany. So this story is written right in the middle of his German sojourn. But it brings to mind exactly what Gershom Shalom said about him. His friend Gershom Shalom said that he knew him. He first met Agnon in Germany when Agnon was not religious, but yet he carried himself as the bearer of tradition. Didn't matter that he didn't have a yarmulke on his head and maybe didn't keep every one of the mitzvot. But all of those people that knew him and admired him in Germany recognized in him something of the representative of tradition. And then Shalom says, and I've known him throughout his long life back here in Jerusalem, where we both lived for many decades, after he returned to very punctilious observance, and yet he always gave the impression of being someone who was completely open-minded. So he kind of paints his portrait of Agnon as this person he calls him a man standing at the crossroads between the old world and the new, between tradition and modernity, and you see that in this story. In the story, there's this picture of the generation gap between the older generation and the boy, the son. But interestingly, it's a story dedicated to his father, Shalom Mordechai Alevi, Chachkis of blessed memory. Not very many Agnon stories carry dedications. This is one of them. So the story begins. It's Buchach. I think the story takes place in 1814, 1815. There's a moment in the story which we're not going to look at where the actual date is given. And it begins, all that week heavy snow fell from the highest heaven to the lowly world. The Jews were gathering in the synagogue. As the day drew to an end, the devout began to assemble in the study house. They go to Daven Mincha Maariv on a weeknight. Suddenly, two old women burst in, howling, pleading for the life of the virtuous, righteous Edele. The name Edele may not be a coincidence. The Baal Shem Tov's daughter was named Edele, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily the connection here. They open the Holy Ark and embrace the Torah scrolls, and they call out to God with great fervor. Rafonola, please God, heal her for the sake of her innocent chicks. From last week's parsha. Thus they wept until their tears joined and flowed together. Between the afternoon and evening prayers, a rumor spread around the Beit Midrash that a tzaddik was coming to town. his handful of followers were much heartened by the news. The common folk assumed that the rabbi was coming to town for the sole purpose of healing Edele. The common folk are who? The Anashim Pshutim or the Chassidim. In other words, the narrator is telling the story from a somewhat objective perspective, but he himself is not a chassid. Why would the Rebbe be coming to town? Well, Edele is sick. And what do Rebbes do? They're, among other things, they're miracle workers. That's what a Baal Shem was. A Baal Shem was something of a healer, a folk healer. He was coming for the sole purpose of healing this Edele, the Edele that we were all davening for in Shul. The daughter of Rabbi Avigdor, the Parnas of the community. Rabbi Avigdor is not a chassid. Agnon elsewhere said that he put a lot of remember his grandfather? Right? Remember the grandfather? So he put a lot of the grandfather into the character of Rabbi Avigdor. But those who knew such a great man detested the sect, the Misnagdim called the Hasidim, the sect, the Kat. Well, they also knew that Rabbi Avigdor would move heaven and earth to stop the tzaddik from setting foot in Shibush. Now, stories written about the town before the Shoah. Agnon did this little play where he took the name of the town Buchach, and he was mishabesh the name Buchach, and he calls it Shibush. The Shibush means what? Mistake, mixed up, mishubash, right? Something that's confused. Maybe I once thought, like, if a translator wanted to, like, translate it into something that captures it, you might call the place, like, Muddleville, right? Like a place where, kind of like the image that we have of Helm, right? A place where everything is right. Shibush is also in Yiddish, a shibishul is a postage stamp, meaning a tiny little nothing. Like if you say about something, it's the size of, you go to see somebody's apartment, it's very small. You want to say, how's that apartment? You say, it's a shibishul, it's like a nothing, it's a gornished, it's a chatzi zayit, right? It's a little. So in other words, it might be a play on the town's name, which captures all these things. It's a little. You would overlook it if you weren't standing in the middle of the town square. You wouldn't know that it was there. But the idea that it's mishubash, this exhibit here on the back wall. You see this. You have here on the back wall. For those of you here in the room, in the back wall over there, you see what's written there about Shibush. You can read that. You can read that afterwards. It happens that in Shibush was not a Hasidic town. Buchach. Historically, Buchach was not a Hasidic town. Right? There were never Admorim that made their Hasidut in Buchach. There were Hasidim, as I mentioned, Agnon's own father. There was a klois, a Hasidic prayer house, but it was never a center of Hasidism, and the Hasidim were always a minority in the town. So Rabbi Avigdor, he would have done anything to keep the Hasidim out of town. So the next day, on Friday afternoon, the Rebbe is coming to town, and his Hasidim are delighted with joy. The Rebbe is coming. His acolytes hasten to approach the carriage. Here's just like a comical scene. The acolytes hasten to approach the carriage, greeting their rabbi, release the horses from their reins, and harness themselves to pull the carriage, because the schut of pulling the carriage that your own Rebbe is in there, better they should be the horse. The rabbi immediately alighted and joined the welcoming crowd. So the Rebbe gets off. They hitch themselves to the wagon. The Chassidim hitch themselves to the wagon in order to pull the Rebbe into town under their own force. But the Rebbe gets off the carriage and walks alongside of them. And they say, Rebbe, what are you doing? And he says, look, I see you doing a mitzvah of achnasat orchim with such enthusiasm. So I came. I also want to do the mitzvah of achnasat orchim. Right? It's this kind of semi-comical depiction of the simplicity of the Hasidim. Well, Rabbi Avigdor will have none of this. The idea that the Hasidim had come to town. At the moment Rabbi Avigdor was coming out of the room of his sick daughter Edele, he heard the exultant voices of the Hasidim accompanying their rabbi on his way. He was outraged and said, "How long must I tolerate this iniquity?" So what does the Parnas do? What was Jewish life like? In these towns, until 1796, Poland, this was Poland, until the end of the 18th century. In three successive motions in the late 18th century, Poland was partitioned between Russia in the north, in the northeast and east, Prussia, which was becomes a German state, in the west, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the south. Until the time that they're done divvying it up, there's no Poland left. And from the end of all of your Eltazadis that came to America or wherever from Poland, they didn't actually live in Poland, because there was no autonomous nation called Poland from 1796 until after World War I. I mean, assuming that your relations left before World War I, that is. There was that, right? We spoke culturally about the place as Poland. Those Jews in Krakow were called Polish Yidden, but there was no such nation called Poland for all of that time. And from that point on, what Galicia, the region that had been southern Poland, what today is western Ukraine, becomes part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time that Agnon is living there, and at the time that this story takes place, the beginning of the 19th century. But yet the Polish noblemen continued to control the different areas. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire allowed this because it kept things stable. Remember, this was very far away removed from Vienna. Right? They couldn't control things that were going on in every little shtetl. So the Polish noblemen continued to exert control over the area. And the Jews in a town like Buchach had a particular amount of autonomy because they were able, more or less, to govern their own affairs as long as they were paying their taxes and not burning the place down and within reason. So Rabbi Avigdor, he's the Parnas, meaning he's like the mayor of the town. But he understands there's certain things he can't do without the official okay of the Polish nobleman who technically owns the town. Buchach was owned by a family called Potocki, or Pataki. The former governor of New York is a descendant, Governor George Pataki is a descendant of this Polish family. So he goes to the Polish nobleman, who will listen and grant his request. And what does he want? He goes to the seat of power driven by fury and vengeance in order to issue an expulsion decree to get rid of this chassid, to banish him from town. So the police come and kick out the Rebbe on Erev Shabbos Emachashecha. As Shabbat's about to begin, as the snow is coming down, they have to leave town. They're wandering out towards a nearby village where they put up at the local inn. As they're leaving, the rabbi's followers protested loudly and clamored for the rabbi to wreak vengeance on his enemies and punish them severely for profaning the name of God and for disrupting the celebration of the Sabbath. The holy man looked into his heart and said, Uriel, his name is Uriel. What does the name Uriel mean? Rebbe Uriel. Light of God. The Misnagid is called Avigdor, which is probably reminiscent of the Arch Misnagid. And here you see the Chabad, the Baal HaTanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, Shner Zalman, was imprisoned by the Russian authorities because the Jews turned him in. The Misnagdim got him. They made accusations against him that he was collecting money and sending it off to Eretz Yisrael, which was then controlled by the Ottoman Turks. Right? They're sending money to the enemy. the Misnagid, that was the arch enemy of the Balatanya, his name was Avigdor. There's a reason, probably. Uriel, of course, is hominetically similar to Shner, right? Shner Zalman of Liadi, the Balatanya. Shner, in the word Shner, is or. It's a Yiddish name, right? They're not etymologically connected, but there's a kind of resonance between the two. The holy man looked into his heart and said, Uriel, Uriel, is it really God's honor you care about or your own? And how can you discern which is the truth? But in the end, human nature prevailed, and he cursed the leader of the community. A harsh imprecation escaped his lips. One of Rebbe Avigdor's own should be cast out. This is a play on a pasuk in Shmuel Bet, chapter 14, verse 14, which is the opposite. Levilti yidach mimenu nidach. Here it's reversed. One of his own should be cast out. All who were present there nodded and said, Avigdor is like a snake which has bitten itself. Right? Meaning Avigdor has brought this on his own. Right? He's going to get what's coming to him. He deserves what's coming. Now, this Adele, remember Adele? So she's dying. Her little children are surrounding her. And people are saying to her husband, Meshulam, the son-in-law of Rabbi Avigdor, there's a tzaddik. He's just in the village. After Shabbos, we can call him and he'll come. And you know what tzaddikim do? They cure people. So Meshulam is quite desperate. He throws his hands in the air and cried from his heart, all hope is lost. I can't endure it anymore. He bolted out of the house. Where did Meshulam go? Whither did he turn? Rabbi Meshulam made his way to the village to ask Rabbi Uriel to entreat God to spare the life of his wife Adele. Well, Rabbi Avigdor, this is really, you're not going to like Rabbi Avigdor for this. But you have to think about it twice before you pass judgment. Rabbi Avigdor was aware of what was going on. As his only daughter was breathing her last, he lowered his aged eyes to her face, and his heavy tears flowed and mingled with her tears. He braced his heart with faith in a merciful God who will take pity on her and send her aid from his holy seat. But at that moment, Rabbi Avigdor considered that people are liable to conclude that it was Uriel's prayer that healed his daughter, and thus they will be led astray on her account. Meaning, if she survives, people will think it was Uriel. In other words, at most, this faker's prayers are a placebo, for we know that he has no power with the divine, being a member of the sect. So if she should be healed, people will be led to the heresy of Hasidut, because they'll think he in fact did perform a miracle. Sometimes coincidences happen. Sometimes you give a placebo, and the person happened not to die. Rabbi Avigdor lifted his eyes towards heaven and said, Master of the universe, please take her soul right now, so that the forces of deceit may not rise in the world because of her. Within minutes, the body's demise was complete, and her soul departed in purity. That's rather harsh. We're going to skip ahead, and I'll tell you what we haven't discovered now by reading only sections. Adele's oldest son is a young man named Gershom. He's around 14, 15. He's already engaged, but in those days he might have had like a long engagement since who's rushing. And he's off learning in yeshiva. In those days, he went off to yeshiva. You came home twice a year. When his mother dies, his grandfather writes a letter telling him the news. Well, you're a young boy. You're 14 years old. You're off at yeshiva. That's reason enough sometimes to be a little depressed. Homesick, cold, hungry. In the study house, the stove had cooled and the cold mist enveloped the furnishings. And he's thinking about his mother, and he's a very brilliant student. He's got a lot of potential. Until her death, he had been unappreciative of his good fortune. And now that she was gone, he was struck by grief, like a person suddenly deprived of the good luck he had been enjoying. Thinking of his mother, he began to chant, and the sound penetrated all the vessels of his heart and drove him to tears. Thinking of her death, he began to moan. He yearned for the day when he would come home in order to use her prayer book. He begins to wonder. He's sitting there in the Beit Midrash. He begins to wonder. Hold on a second. He begins to wonder and question God's ways. Why did he see fit to bring him into the world? Who will open your eyes, Gershom? You inveigh against your Creator, forgetting what your grandfather wrote. You in praise of the Holy One, blessed be He. In the letter that the grandfather writes to him, which appears in the text, we have the whole letter as part of the story. The grandfather tells him, you know, her life was truly a gift, even though she died young. When she was a little girl, she fell through the ice on the river, and she almost drowned. And we were sure she was dead, and she was returned to us. And the reason she was returned to us, now we know, was so that she would bring sons into the world like you, who will do mitzvot and study Torah. What do you think of that? In other words, he's a 14-year-old boy, and he's mourning his mother, and he's doing it by remote because he's off at yeshiva, which may not be. It's not like yeshivas of today. There was no guidance counselor, and the consolation the grandfather sends him is, yes, it's true, your mother died this terrible young death, but it was all okay because you were born in order to study Torah and do mitzvot. Is that a consolation to him? Heavy guilt. Your mother, she was just a salmon that swam upstream in order to spawn, and once she's done that, she can die. But that puts a lot. From the grandfather. Agnon is kind of, I would say, satirizing because the tone here is way too heavy to be satire. But he's sending up this kind of image of, well, the woman's place is to produce boys who will be oskim to b'torah v'mitzvot. And if Rachmanis, she also gives birth to a girl, so she'll give birth to boys that'll be oskim b'torah v'mitzvot. Right? People misunderstood Agnon as being somewhat misogynistic because they confuse the writer with the narrator, or with the words that come out of the character's mouth. But really, he's kind of undermining that worldview. The sensitive reader won't be sympathetic to Rabbi Avigdor's point of view. A naive reader will misunderstand this. So Gershom's saying to himself, you query God's judgment, adding fuel to the fire of hell? Seeing that his musings distracted him from his study, Gershom went home to sleep, hoping that his soul would ascend higher into higher regions, etc. Later, it's almost Pesach. He comes home. It's already a few months after she's died. He comes home for the first time for Passover. During Passover, I'm going to shorten this. I'm going to kind of summarize this a bit. He's looking for a place to daven mincha on Yom Tov. He's walking down the street, and there's a Jew standing at the door saying, "Center, looking for the 10th guy for the minyan." So it looks like just a house. It's not one of the synagogues that he recognizes. It's not one of the Batei Midrash that he knows. It looks like somebody's making a minyan in their home. So he goes in, and they start davening, and he realizes they're Hasidim. Now, first of all, this is fascinating. Today, could you imagine walking into a Hasidic house of prayer and not knowing that it's a Hasidic house of prayer? You know, we live a kind of shelter. Everybody lives in a bubble. Just my bubble and somebody else's bubble might be different. So we live in Efrat. There aren't too many Hasidim hanging around. But a couple of years ago, it was more than a couple of years ago, when my oldest was maybe around bar mitzvah age, maybe 10 years ago. We went to a Haredi neighborhood for Shabbos to be with people we know. My son, like real Haredi. I don't mean like Beit Shemesh. I mean like real, Mattersdorf, like the real thing. And my son was like fascinated because like you do like it's all sociology. These guys twist their payas this way, and those guys twist their payas that way, and these guys put their payas behind their ears, and these guys put their payas under their kippah on their head. These guys tuck their black pants into white stockings, and those people have pants that go down the end of the whole thing. He picked up on it. These people have the kippota with the stripes, and these people have the kippota that's this. This has a hat, and that one is a strimal, and that one is a spodik, and then he understood that like the Yankees wear white with blue pinstripes, and the Mets wear blue with orange decoration. He understood that these were all the different uniforms. That wasn't true in the early days of Hasidut. You didn't automatically know that from their dress that they were Hasidim. You could walk into a minyan and not realize that they're Hasidim until you start hearing the nusach of the davening, right? Instead of saying, they start saying the Kedusha according to the Nusach HaAri, right? According to the different prayer tradition of the Hasidim. And he realizes, I've walked into a trap. Elama, the melody of the prayer penetrated his heart, and he didn't leave. When they were done with the prayer, they began to dance and sing the holiday song, "You Have Chosen Us," Ata V'Chartanu. So if we assume that this is Chabad, so this is the nigun. Well, his lips began to softly sing the melody until they finished dancing and wished each other good Yom Tov. Gershon left the Hasidic prayer house with a sense of vitality and vigor coursing through his limbs. He suddenly come back alive. It's decided after Pesach that he shouldn't go back to the yeshiva. They understand how traumatized he's been. And they hire a teacher, a tutor, to learn with him one-on-one, because that's what the wealthy were able to do. This tutor is someone called the Choser. We really struggled with what to do in the translation here. A Choser is a Hasidic position. The Rebbe it has two different meanings that are complementary. On one hand, the Choser means there's a fancy word for it in French, like the person in the university who gives in yeshiva we call it the Chazara Shir, right? And the Chazara Shir in yeshiva is the Rav gives a shiur, and it's complicated and it's got all the courses, but not everybody can follow. So the teacher's assistant is a Choser. Meaning he goes over, he reviews the lesson with the pupils that need to go over it one more time. So the Hasidim, the Choser, the repetitor, yes, right, the repeater, right. So we struggle. Should we call this fellow the repeater? That's gonna be awkward. So we opted to just leave the word Choser in the translation. So the Rebbe was the way that Rabbi Nachman was a choser for Rabbi Nachman, because he didn't repeat it orally, he repeated it in writing. The choser could also be what in Chabad is called meshulach, right? The shlichim, the people that go out who are choser, they circle around, spreading the word, bringing in new. So this is meaning the choser. We, the reader of the story, know that he's called the choser. The characters in the story don't know that he's the characters in the story don't know that he's chassid. Rabbi Avigdor hires him to teach the grandson, not knowing that he's invited the Yetzer Hara into the house. And the choser says to Gershon, today let's study a simple page of Talmud. Gershon was puzzled. Why would this eminent scholar who tackled the greatest problems wish to study a simple page of Gemara? The choser noted Gershon's perplexity and said, look how blind human beings are. A person sees something and thinks it's very simple, where in fact it is complex and full of different meanings. About such people, the scripture says, but they regard not the work of the Lord. And he continued expanding, astonishing exegesis. And then he takes a very simple page of Gemara, nothing that a learned scholar, somebody with Gershon's talent, would spend much time on. He would go on to more complicated things. And the choser is able to show him the deepest depths, the highest of the high, the most profound profundities, even in the most simple things. And Gershon is able to get a little chiyus, get a little life out of his learning once again, even though this is not the type of learning that Rabbi Avigdor would approve of. There's a passage here where he quotes the Baal Tanya. I'll skip that. And through this learning, it was then that the sheath of the tender soul shuddered, and the whole town of Shibush was at once separated from it. Yearnings that the townspeople had never experienced welled up in his heart, shining through his eyes that pored over the Torah and ascended heavenward in search of the ineffable. But his fingers were blind and fumbled through the space like a sightless person groping in the dark. From that moment on, a heavy melancholy descended on him, and tremendous sorrow enveloped his tender face. In other words, he's shown joy, but he can't achieve it himself. He wanders accidentally into the Hasidic house of prayer, and the proximity to joy only makes him understand how far removed it is from himself. And presumably, witnessing how others feel so close to God makes him understand the gap that he feels between himself and the holy. By now, Gershon had abandoned his books and was not reading any of them. He can't go back to his learning. He sat by himself in God's shadow, imbibing holy thoughts. From time to time, the master walked in, and then master and student engaged in questions and answers. And together they elaborated and expanded on the words of the living God, praised, lauded, extolled, and glorified their heavenly Father. When the choser left him, Gershon would sit on the floor, his head between his knees, like the early mystics. Great God, Gershon groaned from the depths of his heart, you created the Garden of Eden, put flaming sword in its gate. May my bones burn in hell so long as one tiny particle of them reaches your throne. But how many firmaments separate one from his creator? How can a soul ascend to its God? And a divine voice murmuring like a dove said, woe to the children that are exiled from their father's table. That's the Gemara in Brachot, Daf Gimel, which is the idea of being banished from your father's table is a rabbinic metaphor for the rebellious son. Right? The maskilim, those that, grew up in religious homes and went off to Volozhin and were studying literature, philosophy between the pages of the Gemara, they referred to themselves as those banished from Father's table, even though they had rebelled. They weren't banished. Right? Remember the story is called The Banished, the Outcast. They cast themselves out. Banished from the Father's table, and when will they come back? Has not the time come for them to return? Why should we linger in this lowly world you created? And then the final page of the story, I'm sorry, I know it's late. Somebody has to sneak out. It won't affect your final grade. Gershon no longer favored his books and did not even look at them. Instead, his lips mumbled blessings and supplications. One Sabbath eve, the choser entered Gershon's room, took out the Song of Songs and began to interpret verses, words, letters, cancellation notes, and all the sacred and awesome secrets embedded in them. Thus he interpreted and elucidated as the maiden of Israel when she originally recited the Song of Songs in front of the husband of her youth, the Holy One, blessed be he. That's the mashal, the metaphor that's in the Song of Songs, the relationship between the divine love story between God and the Jewish people. The face of the east had turned red, and the vault of heaven nearest the earth was getting darker and darker, but the Jewish houses were lit up with Sabbath candles. The Choser peered out and said, "It's time to welcome the Sabbath," and he departed. Gershon stood motionless, reviewing everything he had heard, and his exhalation was so great that he wanted to cry. He leaned against the wall and did not budge for a while. Eventually he shook himself and said, "It's time to welcome the Sabbath." He wrenched himself from the wall and went to the synagogue. When he got to the synagogue, he found most of the congregants already at prayer reciting Shir HaShirim. That's the custom, to recite Shir HaShirim as Shabbat enters, because Shir HaShirim is this metaphor of the relationship between God and the Jewish people, and that reunion of God and Jewish people takes place with the inauguration of the Sabbath. He opened his prayer book and then held his head between his hands for a moment. When he lifted his head, he began to recite Shir HaShirim with tremendous fervor and with awesome power. He's achieving it. It's coming. He's having a moment of dvekut, of connecting to God. Thus he continued to read until he reached the verse, "Draw me, we will run after thee. Mashcheni acharecha v'narutza." And when he reached the verse, "Draw me, we will run after thee," his soul departed in purity. His lips were still whispering, "Havieni hamelech haneres." The Lord, the King, will bring me into his chambers, which is interpreted as this moment of union with God, when you're allowed to enter into take the Rambam's non-Kabbalistic metaphor of the king in his palace, right? You know, like there's the king, there's different circles, and the king is on the top of the palace, and some people are down in the village, and others are close, and some are in the antechamber, and only few can enter into the palace. And as he's saying that verse, he expires. His soul departed while uttering the verse. Thus died Gershom, the grandson of Rabbi Avigdor, because Rabbi Avigdor struggled with Rabbi Uriel and quarreled with Hasidim. So it seems like a tragedy. I have a friend recently. Well, how do you interpret it? Not as a tragedy. You can pass these sheets around. You pass them. Yeah, so most people read it as a tragedy. I have a good friend who was ill recently, and I gave him a copy of this book as a gift. And he told me he read it and enjoyed it, that he was reading the story. So I wrote to him. We were communicating back and forth by email. So I said, "Gee, I'm sorry, it's not such a good gift for somebody." I mean, he was really sick. Thank God he had a refuah shlema, but it was really a close call. And I said, "I guess it's not. Maybe I should have chosen a different story, but because it doesn't end well. He dies in the end." So my friend wrote back, "Someone who dies in a moment of divine rapture. What could be better than that?" So I thought that was an interesting response on his part. Don't you? Most people don't read the story that way. Most read it as a tragedy, right? This young boy who, torn between the tradition of his home and trying to seek something else, can't be at home in either one. Now, Agnon is drawing on a whole variety of sources. In other words, Rabbi Avigdor, in order to prevent Rabbi Uriel from succeeding, we'll try to finish this up in a couple minutes. In order to try to prevent Rabbi Uriel from succeeding, Rabbi Avigdor, he doesn't kill his own daughter, but he makes sure that there's no evidence of a miracle. He's prepared to forego a miracle in order to, could you imagine someone in a position like that? What wouldn't you do for a miracle? right? Your own child. What wouldn't you do for a miracle? So he says, I'm not prepared to do everything for a miracle. I'm not prepared to have heresy flourish in order to get a miracle. Well, he's a pretty clear he's a pretty clear rationalist, Rabbi Avigdor. He says that's not the way the world works. As he knows, I mean, on the other hand, we're very harsh on Rabbi Avigdor, but how many people say DNR? When you know medicine has run out, I'm not paskening in a shilas here, you understand. But when you know that medicine has run out, so a lot of people say, let me go. Don't extend it, right? Don't extend the suffering. So we're not so harsh, we're not so critical about that point of view, generally speaking. On the contrary, you can understand it. So maybe that's what Rabbi Avigdor is saying. Look, she's dying. There's nothing's gonna save her, right? So better she should go peacefully than to be disturbed by this nonsense of the Hasidic. I'm trying to describe the point of view. I'm not passing a shayla. I'm not passing judgment. I'm saying there's two sides to the story. Rather than have this Rebbe come and pray for her and let someone say, "Oh, he did a miracle," right? Since that's not necessarily, Rabbi Avigdor says that's not how miracles happen. That's not how God runs the universe, right? What would happen? She'll Rabbi Avigdor, the chassan will come and he'll daven, and then she'll open her eyes for a moment, and then she'll pass. And they'll say, "Oh, it was a miracle. You saw she opened her eyes." Right? So Rabbi Avigdor, he's read the medical journals. He knows how it works. Right? But other people, simple people, are liable to interpret it differently. So Rabbi Avigdor is willing to, I'll say, kill his daughter, have his daughter pass on, so that there won't be evidence of Hasidic power, but it's typically Agnonian irony, because in the end, the Hasidic power exerts itself where? On the grandson. Not in a magical way, not in a supernatural way, in a very human way. Here's somebody who's looking for something. Here's someone who suffered. Here's someone for whom the Hasidic joy, the Ata v'chartanu, the sweet melody provides something that the cold, these aren't Litvaks, you understand. This is Galicia. But this Agnon is telling the story from a psychological perspective. Freud has as much to say here as Rabbi Nachman does. In the rabbi's son, in Rabbi Nachman's story, there's this mystical backdrop, right? The father's stubbornness is what invites the Yetzer Hara to show up and to cause all of these maladies and mishaps up until the point that the son dies. It creates space. The father in the Rabbi Nachman story creates space for the Yetzer Hara or the Satan to enter and do his misdeeds. And in that way, it is like Rabbi Avigdor. Rabbi Avigdor's stubbornness is what creates this return of the repressed that comes and somehow captures the soul of little Gershon until he's just ripped asunder. The father assumes in Rabbi Nachman, the father assumes that he can divine God's will by setting up these kinds of tests, right? If the horses fall, or if the axles break, or if, right? But none of those things are anything other than the work of the devil himself. So this idea that we know who the good Jew is, or we can set up a kind of litmus test to determine who the good Jew is, both on the part of the father in the first story or of Rabbi Avigdor in our story, is part of what Agnon is trying to send up. There's the sources that you have in front of you and those that are on the screen are sources in Rabbi Nachman that even though the story is not directly engaging with Breslov, but it's informed by these sources. In Hasidut, and in Breslov in particular, there's a notion of nafshi yatsa b'dabro. There's a pasuk in Shir Shirim. The beloved is in bed. She's pining away for her lover. Kol dodi dofek. He's on the other side, but she tarries, and until she knows that he's al kapot hamanul, on the other side of the lock. Agnon's collection of love stories is entitled Al Kapot HaManul, at the handles of the lock. Because all of his love stories are stories of love squandered, of missing the moment, of getting to open the door just a moment too late. Almost none of his love stories end happily ever after. By the time she gets there, Chamak Avar, he flew the coop. She missed it. She hears his voice, Nafshi yatsa b'dabro. I could die just listening to his voice. Remember when you were young and in love, right? When I was I got married a little later, but when I was in college, I had a friend who got engaged our senior year of college, and they would be on the phone the whole night. Remember in college, it'd be like a phone with like a long cord. So they'd be on the phone. He'd be like I'd be trying to sleep, but he'd be like under the covers, like talking to her in a whisper, and then he'd have to open the covers in order to breathe. And like in the morning, the phone would still be off the hook. The line would still be connected, right? And because they'd both fallen asleep with the phone. Right? That kind of like love sickness, nafshi, just hearing his voice, I could die. Right, I'm ready to just listening. I hear his voice, and my soul is ready to leave. That's the pasuk in Shir Shirim. Hasidus, it's repurposed. Not that when I hear his voice, I could die, but through the act of speech, I lose my soul, or you might say, I can kill myself. This is an idea which is revisited in multiple places in Agnon. You have it in Tehillah, you have it here, elsewhere. That Gershon times his death through the recitation of Shir Hashirim. He brings himself to a moment of spiritual ecstasy and then expires through that. The idea, this Kabbalistic mystical idea, is present here in Rabbi Nachman. He says in a few places, we don't have time to go through it all, and you can read it here yourselves, right? But in Likutei Moharan, part 2, section 99, he says, Rabbi Nachman said the essence of the perfect hitbodedut. Hitbodedut is this kind of like religious seclusion in which you unify with the divine. Conversation with one's maker is when a person speaks to God so extensively that his soul is close to departing, God forbid, until he just about expires. Ad sheyeh samuch ma'od shetetzeh nishmato, God forbid. And so because of the intensity of his genuine pain and longing and yearning for God, his soul is tied to his body by no more than a thread. This is clarified in the teachings of our sages, etc. There's another passage here which I don't have on the screen. I apologize to those of you online, from what's called the Sichot Haran, which are kind of recordings. Rabbi Nassan wrote up these kinds of notes, conversation notes. He wrote down the conversations of Rabbi Nachman about a case of Rabbi Nachman's grandson who was quite ill, and a similar idea, but also with the presence at the end. You see, Ki hu yitbarach choshev machshavot labal yidach mimenu nidach, lest anyone who is cast out remain pushed away. The same presence of HaNidach. I'll just end, and I apologize. We've gone so long. We've gone so late. The idea of the generation gap, the idea of the conflict between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim, the idea of the conflict between the religious and the secular, which was a growing concern to Rabbi Nachman and the time of Rabbi Nachman, the conflict between Zionism and anti-Zionism. That's a topic that Agnon explores in his Maaseh Ha'ez, his famous, well-known story, which is a story of a generation gap, of the young boy who goes through the cave to Eretz Yisrael, and the father who's left behind, and the father who, thinking his son is dead, says, "Oy voy, oily leish kipech et mazlo biyadav," right? Which is more or less exactly what the father in the Rebbe Nachman story says at the end. The story ends, and of course it's reminiscent of Kafka and his complicated relationship with his own father, and of Freud and what Freud had to say about the relationships with fathers, which was of course much different than what he had to say about his relationships with sons. So for Agnon didn't suffer any of these things. He had a happy relationship with his father and a happy relationship with his grandfather, but he understood that the whole thing becomes a mashal. It's a metaphor for the state of the Jewish people going through these transitions. He understood it profoundly in terms of Zionism and anti-Zionism and what it meant for a younger generation to come through the magic cave, or in his case, on a boat, and arrive in Eretz Yisrael. He writes a story in the 1930s called Bilvav Yamim, In the Heart of the Seas, which is a story of a group of, it's a completely asynchronous story, or what's the word? It doesn't fit into its time. It's a story that's set just a few years after HaNidach, and a bunch of Hasidim are going up from Buchachan Aliyah at a time when, in the 1830s, people were not going on mass Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael from Buchach or from anywhere else. And one of the Nilbavim, one of these hardy men going up, ascending to the land, is the young brother. Agnon often did this. He'd take a minor character who makes a cameo in one story and make him the center of another story. The younger brother of Rabbi Gershon, who succeeds in Havienu HaMelech Haderav. Let the king bring me into his chamber, but the chamber here is a place not in the supernal realm, but in this world, Eretz Yisrael. It's a story written in the 30s. He's saying more about the 1930s, than he was about the 1830s. What it meant for people to be coming back at that time. That there is a way to find that reunion with God, the mystical reunion, which is actually quite prosaic here in the building of the land. And when these fellows make their way to Eretz Yisrael, some in a very realistic way, sailing by sea, and others in a rather miraculous way. And they get to the Kotel. Rabbi Moshe reveals to them the young brother. He's now an old man. It's a generation later. He sings for them the song, Mashcheni acharecha v'narutza havieni hamelech haderav. Pull me and I will follow you. We'll run after you. And the king will bring us into the chamber. And he sings the song that was on the lips of his brother Gershon at the moment that he expired, unable to build a bridge between heaven and earth. But there's hope that in the next generation that might be achieved. So really, Agnon turns the whole story, if I'm interpreting correctly, one story in light of the other. It becomes a metaphor for Zionism and for the return to Eretz Yisrael and for Jewish renewal, national renewal here in the land, which is the only canvas on which this can play out without causing the crisis, the shesa, the division that rent poor Gershon's soul asunder. So So you see, it's a perfect example of what I mentioned already quite a while ago at the beginning of our conversation, of taking a story, setting it in the genre of an old pietistic tale, set in a time long before Jewish modernity, but saying very profound things about the condition of the time in which the story is written. Next week, if you'd like to get the sources by email, make sure I have your correct email. Next week, in our final session, we will read a very short story, and hopefully we'll do it a lot quicker than we did this tonight. We'll do a very short story called Hashir Asher Hushar. In English, it's called The Song Which Was Sung, which is one of the stories. In English, it's also in this collection. But in Hebrew, it's in the collection Samuch V'Nireh, which is the Sefer HaMaasim, the collection of surrealistic, Kafkaesque, Nachmanesque tales. It's a story that takes place in Shari Chesed, on Rehov Hashlo. You know, on Rehov Hashlo near Wolfson, there's that little Breslov shtibel. The story is set in that shtibel. Thank you for your endurance. I apologize for the length. If you got an email, did you get the email last week? So then you'll get it again. Thank you to all of you online. Nice to see you.